The ring was silver and set with a stone the color of a new moon, pale, almost luminous, the kind of thing a woman notices even across a crowded room. Serafina had noticed it 6 months ago on her own finger, placed there with trembling hands and a voice that cracked on the word forever. She had kissed the knuckle it rested on. She had pressed it to her sternum when she slept, feeling its small cold weight against her heartbeat like a promise. She wasn't wearing it now. It was on someone else's hand, and that hand was currently tucked into the crook of Daniel's arm as he walked her across the embassy ballroom floor. Serafina stood at the edge of the room with a flute of something sparkling and untouched, watching her fiancé laugh at something his mistress said. The woman's name was Celeste, and she was beautiful in the way that curated things are beautiful, polished, deliberate, expensive. She wore the Luna ring the way she wore everything else Daniel had given her, like she'd always owned it, like it had always been hers. Like the weight of the stone on her finger was the most natural thing in the world, and Serafina's 6 months of sleeping with it pressed against her heart had been some kind of administrative error soon to be corrected. Serafina was not corrected, she was simply ignored. It was worse. She had dressed carefully for this evening, the way she dressed carefully for every function that her job required her to attend. The deep green shift dress that made her skin look rich as earth, the single gold earring she wore in each lobe, her hair in a crown that had taken 40 minutes and her neighbor's assistance. She had known when she arrived that Daniel would be here. She had not known about the ring. She had seen it catch the light from across the ballroom and stopped walking mid-step, and for a moment the noise of the room had gone completely silent, the way noise goes silent when the body is processing something too large for ordinary perception. Then she had taken a flute of something sparkling from a passing tray and found the edge of the room and stood there, watching. She was not made for crying in ballrooms. She was not made for scenes or raised voices or the particular theater of public betrayal. She was made for other things, for 17-hour shifts in the exobiology wing of the Federal Research Station, for calibrating xenochemical sensors with her eyes half closed, for translating alien molecular sequences that had taken other researchers months to decode, for the quiet, focused work of understanding things that most people didn't want to bother understanding. She had been told, at various points in her life, that this quality was admirable. She had been told, equally, that it was difficult. She had been told that she was too much inside her own head, too absent, too committed to work that did not commit back. Daniel had said once that she was brilliant and exhausting in equal measure, and that he loved both things about her. He had said this while she was explaining a xenochemical anomaly at 2 in the morning, and she had thought, at the time, that it was romantic. She thought about that now. She finished thinking about it. She set her untouched glass down on a passing tray and walked out. She did not say goodbye. She did not look back. She went through the gilded doors of the embassy and out into the Johannesburg night, where the air smelled like jasmine and exhaust and something else, something sharp and barely there at the back of her throat, something her body registered half a second before her conscious mind did. She stopped on the steps of the embassy. She breathed in slowly, deliberately. She had spent 7 years studying atmospheric xenochemistry. She noticed things in the air that other people's bodies processed without their awareness. She noticed the temperature differential between this breath and the last one. She noticed the particular humidity signature, the particulate composition, the faint ghost of something that did not belong to Johannesburg's ordinary night air. Something was being carried on the wind. She stood on the embassy steps in her green dress in the warm night and breathed it in, and felt the shape of something vast beginning to move. It had started 3 months before the night of the ring, though Serafina wouldn't learn that until later. The full picture assembled itself slowly, the way all important pictures did, piece by piece, each fragment appearing insignificant until you had enough of them to see the architecture underneath. The Vreth had arrived without fanfare, which was itself a kind of fanfare, the absence of the dramatic entrance that humanity had spent decades imagining, scripting, rehearsing in 1,000 films and novels and collective anxieties. No ships breaking through atmosphere with fire and noise. No transmission on every frequency, no shadow falling across the earth, no countdown to first contact. One morning, before most of the planet had woken up, the atmospheric sensors at 47 research stations across the globe logged an anomaly simultaneously. A molecular compound of non-terrestrial origin, dispersed at high altitude, drifting down through the stratosphere in a pattern too precisely even to be natural, too comprehensively global to be accidental. Formula 9 Vreth, the researchers named it later in the clipped language of scientific necessity. The aliens called it something that translated, when you had the tools to translate it, as the shaping breath. The name was not poetic ornament. It was a literal description. The Vreth were architects of biology the way humans were architects of cities, methodically, across generational timeframes, with a vision that extended beyond any individual life. They had been engineering the cellular foundations of species for longer than humanity had possessed written language. They did not announce themselves beforehand. In the hierarchy of the galaxy's elder races, asking permission of a species that hadn't yet reached its nearest star was roughly equivalent to a surgeon explaining the procedure to the anesthesia. The compound did not kill. That distinction was important, and it was the first thing Serafina noted in her analysis. It did not physically harm. What it did was more nuanced and, to the Vreth mind, more necessary. It unlocked. It found whatever it was in the human genome that had been suppressed or muted or buried under 10,000 years of civilization's particular pressures. The specific demands that survival made on creatures who had to cooperate to persist, who had built cultures and hierarchies and expectations around what a person should want and feel and be, and it let those hidden things breathe. Desires long denied rose to the surface quietly, like water through permeable stone. Bonds forged from obligation rather than genuine feeling began to dissolve at their edges, not catastrophically but inevitably, the way ice melts when the season turns. People who had spent their lives performing one version of themselves and secretly housing another began, without drama or announcement, to become the person they had been keeping in the dark. For a great many humans, this was experienced as devastation. Lives arranged around structures that now felt hollow, relationships that had depended on the maintenance of a certain careful fiction, identities built on the suppression of things that had now surfaced, all of it subjected to the merciless light of what was actually true. For a great many others, it was the first morning of their actual life. The governments of Earth chose devastation as their official position. Within 72 hours of the compound's detection, the Federal Emergency Council had convened in closed session, and within 48 hours after that, the first framework documents were circulating through classified channels. Serafina received the briefing cascade that morning in her lab, as she was in the middle of her third hour of analysis on the compound's molecular signature. She set down her coffee, terrible coffee. The lab never stocked anything better, and she'd stopped noticing, and read the briefing the way she read everything, carefully, completely, and with the particular attention of someone who had learned that what documents don't say is often more informative than what they do. The compound was being described as a pathogen. The framing was consistent and precise. Pathogen, foreign agent, bioterrorism. The Vreth, who had made no communication and displayed no military posture and showed no territorial interest in the planet below them, were being positioned as hostile actors in a narrative that was being built before anyone understood what had actually happened. She flagged 3 factual inaccuracies in the first 2 pages and sent her corrections up the chain. She received an automated acknowledgement. She heard nothing back. She returned to her analysis. What she found, over 14 days of work that she extended into nights with the help of the terrible coffee, and the song her mother had sung while braiding her hair when she was 8. A melody she'd never been able to stop humming when she was deep in something important, the tune surfacing from somewhere below conscious thought like a habit of the blood, was this. The compound was not a pathogen. It had no replication mechanism. It was not designed to spread or persist or colonize. It was, in the most precise clinical language, a single-use intervention, dispersed once, activated once, metabolized completely within 72 hours of initial contact, leaving no ongoing biological presence. Whatever it had done to the human population, it had already done. There was no continuing exposure. There was no mechanism for secondary transmission. There was nothing to defend against. What there was an intervention so elegant that looking at it too long started to feel like looking at a proof. The xenochemical signature was unlike anything in the terrestrial or catalogued extraterrestrial databases. It was layered, not just in its molecular structure, but in its logic, in the way each component related to the others, the way the whole was more precisely calibrated than any of the parts taken individually. It had been designed to find something specific in the human genetic architecture, and to find it gently, and to leave the tissue it passed through entirely unharmed. She built the analysis over 14 days. It ran 400 pages. She submitted it through 4 separate channels. 3 channels returned automated errors. The 4th produced a visit, 2 days later, from a man in a gray suit who told her, with the polite implacability of bureaucratic authority, that her security clearance was under review and that she should refrain from distributing further analysis until the review was complete. She looked at the man in the gray suit for a moment. "Of course," she said. She waited until he left. She made a copy of everything on a personal drive. She had actually begun doing this the week before, when she saw where the briefings were heading, but it seemed beside the point to mention it. She did not go home after the ballroom. She never went home when something was wrong. Home was where she went when there was nothing left to do, and she had never been good at nothing left to do. She went to the lab instead, let herself in with the keycard the gray suit hadn't gotten around to pulling, and she sat at her workstation in her green dress and her gold earrings and looked at the bare dent on her finger where the Luna ring used to sit. The evening had that particular clarity that follows a blow, everything simplified. The noise went away, and what remained was just the essential shape of things. She opened the xenochemical database she'd been building in secret for 3 months, and she got back to work. The compound's molecular grammar had been occupying a corner of her mind since she first mapped it. It was not random. The sequencing had an internal logic that went beyond functional chemistry. It had the architecture of a language, not metaphorically, literally. A syntax, a grammar, a system of relationships between elements that operated like meaningful communication rather than mere mechanism. She had been parsing it the way she'd parse a text in an unfamiliar tongue, identifying recurring structures, mapping relationships, building towards something she couldn't yet name but could feel the shape of from the outside, the way you can sometimes sense the presence of land before you can see it. At 2:17 in the morning, 3 weeks after the gray suit's visit, she parsed the final layer. She sat very still. She looked at what she was looking at. Then she made herself another terrible coffee and looked at it again, because she needed to be certain. She was always certain before she moved. It wasn't just a language. It was a message. Specific, targeted, embedded in the compound's deepest structural layer like a letter written in the ink of biology itself. A question, rendered in molecular grammar that would only be legible to someone who had spent years mapping the compound's xenochemical syntax with precisely the kind of obsessive precision that most institutions did not fund, and most colleagues considered eccentric. She was, she reflected, being profoundly grateful for her eccentricities. The message said, "Do you understand what we have given you?" She sent her response the next morning, using the xenochemical modeling software she'd built herself over 18 months, translating back into the molecular grammar of the compound as precisely as her tools allowed. "Yes," she wrote, "I understand, I want to talk." The response came in 11 minutes. Not a message this time, coordinates, dimensional coordinates, a resonance frequency rendered in the same molecular syntax, and the implicit communication that she had the tools to use it if she chose. She chose. It took 4 hours to modify her instruments to open the channel. She hummed throughout. Her mother's song filled the lab in the small hours of the morning, barely audible, traveling through the empty room like a thread, connecting her to something she couldn't have named if asked. At 3:47 in the morning, the resonance field opened. The figure that formed in it was not what she'd imagined, though she couldn't have specified what she'd imagined. She had tried not to. Going in, preconception was the enemy of accurate observation. But even with that discipline, the reality was startling in the way that profoundly alien things are startling. Not because they are monstrous, but because they reveal, in their difference, how narrow your frame of reference has been. He was large. The geometry of him was almost mammalian in its basic symmetry, and then carefully, decisively not bilateral structure that resolved into a third axis when you tracked it long enough. A face that suggested expression without providing the specific hardware humans used to make it. Eyes that were dark in the way that deep water is dark. Not empty. Full. Full of something that light hadn't reached yet, that might be very old or might be something else entirely. He looked at her, she looked at him. Neither spoke for a long moment. She did not fill the silence with noise. This was one of the things people found difficult about her, and one of the things she'd never been able to change. She did not fill silences. She sat in them. She had learned that silence was information if you let it be. "You are the one who answered," he said, finally. The voice her translation software rendered for her was low and resonant, a frequency just inside the lower range of human hearing, felt as much as heard. "I'm the one who could read the question," she said. "We sent it to every human who had touched the compound data. You were the only one who read it." She absorbed this. That's either a compliment or a very specific indictment of my field. The geometry of his face shifted in a way her software tagged as possible amusement. "Both, perhaps. Your species is young. It does not yet value the things that will matter most to it. We're working on it." "You are," he said. "Some of you." His name, the resonance pattern she was to use to address him, translated to something in the range of Lord of the Dark between stars. She abbreviated it to King immediately and without apology, because she was a scientist, and she had to call things what she could say out loud. She learned in the conversation that followed that the title was not ceremonial but descriptive. Among the Vreth, the elder architects were addressed by the space they had shaped. He had shaped the biological foundations of civilizations, across a region of the galaxy vast enough that the light from its far edge had not yet reached Earth. He had also, personally, formulated the shaping breath. She looked at him across the resonance channel and thought about 400 pages of analysis and 3 automated error messages and 1 gray suit. "Why did you do it without asking?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Would you have said yes?" "That's not the question." "No," he agreed. "The question is whether we had the right to ask it at all." He paused. "We have been asking that question ourselves for longer than your civilization has existed. We have not reached consensus. You have a civilizational ethics debate that's older than humanity, and you still administered the compound. We have consensus on the outcome, not the method." "What's the outcome?" "Your species survives to reach the stars. In our records, 97.3% of species that receive the shaping breath before achieving interstellar capacity go on to become stable members of the galactic network. Species that reach the stars carrying their suppressed selves unresolved." He paused. "They tend to resolve them externally. The galaxy has seen enough of that. The Vreth stopped finding it acceptable 9,000 years ago." Serafina looked at the ceiling of her lab. She looked back at him. "You should have asked," she said. "Yes," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of it, no defense, no deflection that she hadn't anticipated. "We should have." "But you didn't." "No. And you're not sorry you did it." "We are sorry about the method," he said. "We are not sorry that your species will survive." She sat with that for a long moment. Outside the lab windows, Johannesburg was dark and quiet, the city doing its nighttime business of continuing to exist. Somewhere out there, the wind was carrying the last traces of something non-terrestrial, and people were waking up to versions of themselves they hadn't known were waiting. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing you are not already doing," he said. "You are building understanding. We are here to add to it if you want that." "And if I don't?" "We wait. We are good at waiting." She thought about Daniel in the ballroom with her ring on someone else's finger. She thought about the gray suit with his document and his review process. She thought about the automated error messages, swallowing 400 pages of work. "I don't want to wait," she said. "I've been waiting long enough." They talked for 19 hours without stopping. She lost track of time in the way she only did when something was genuinely absorbing her, when the thing she was doing was important enough to overwrite the ordinary timekeeping of hunger and fatigue. He told her about the Vreth, not everything, not the full deep cosmology or the complete history of their interventions, but enough. A civilization so ancient that it had forgotten what it felt like to be uncertain about whether it would survive. That had watched species after species reach toward the stars and pull back from the heat of their own fire. That had developed the shaping breath not as a weapon, but as the gentlest possible intervention they knew how to make, the minimum necessary adjustment to give a young species the internal conditions it needed to become the thing it was capable of being. He told her about the wars that had not happened because of the breath, the civilizations that had consumed themselves and their neighbors in conflicts that traced back, ultimately, to the suppression of things that had needed to be acknowledged and were not. He told her about species that had developed incredible technology and terrible self-knowledge simultaneously, and what happened when that combination reached the stars. She told him about the 400-page report, about the gray suit, about the way the Federal Emergency Council had taken a biology event and built a war narrative around it in 3 days, because war was a framework they understood and biology was complicated. She told him about xenochemical sensors and the particular loneliness of spending a career on something most people would rather not look at directly. She told him about her mother's song when he asked what the sound was that accompanied her work. "A melody," she said. "My mother sang it while she braided my hair when I was a child. I can't stop it from surfacing when I concentrate." "That is a beautiful thing," he said, in his resonant below-hearing voice. "It's embarrassing," she said. "I hum in labs." "The Vreth do not have music," he said. "We have mathematical compositions, sequences that carry information and structure simultaneously. What you describe is different. It carries something else." "What?" He considered. "Memory," he said, "warmth carried across time." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away at her instruments, because sometimes looking directly at things that were unexpectedly moving was its own kind of scientific discipline. He told her what came next. The shaping breath was the introduction, the loosening of the soil, as he described it. What followed for every species that had received it was an invitation. The offer to enter the network, not as a subordinate species to be managed, not as a resource to be extracted, but as a participant in the long project of the galaxy's mutual sustenance. The education was slow by human standards. It was permanent. The offer required a translator, someone who could carry meaning between the human world and the Vreth frame of reference without losing it in transit. Someone with the linguistic precision to render concepts that had no human analog and the cultural fluency to know what a human government would accept, and what it would panic at, and how to bridge the distance between those two things. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you answered," he said. "There has to be more to it than that." "There is, but it is the necessary condition. Of the humans who read the compound data, only you recognized the language underneath it. Of those, only you chose to respond rather than report. Of those," he paused, "there was only you." She turned this over. "And you're asking me to be the official first contact translator for humanity's entry into a galactic civilizational network?" "Yes." "On the basis of a 19-hour conversation. On the basis of 7 years of xenochemical training, 14 months of secret analysis conducted in defiance of your institution's suppression, a 400-page report that demonstrated the clearest understanding of our work that any human has produced. And yes," another face shift, that almost smile, 19 hours of conversation. She thought about the gray suit, about automated error messages, about sitting in the lab at 3:47 in the morning with her mother's song in the air and the shape of something about to matter forming under her hands. "Serafina," she said, "call me Serafina. 19 hours is long enough." The gray suit returned in force 3 days later. 2 colleagues this time, and a document 7 pages long that used the phrase national security interest 11 times and contained a legal framework that she recognized, having read several similar documents in her security clearance training, as the kind that was prepared in advance for situations that were expected to be contentious. She read the document carefully. She looked at the 3 men standing in her lab. She thought about how her work had moved through her life, always at the edges of what institutions wanted to fund, always producing results that the people who controlled the funding found complicated, always submitted through channels that returned automated errors. She felt something that was not fear and not quite anger, something calmer and more settled than either. The feeling of standing in a wind she understood the composition of. "I'd like to see the authorization," she said. They had it. She read it carefully. "This authorizes seizure of materials produced in the course of my federal employment," she said. "The xenochemical models on my personal drive were produced on my personal time using personal equipment." A brief silence. "Additionally," she said, "the transmission you've identified as unauthorized contact has already generated a full diplomatic response protocol. Seizing my work doesn't terminate the contact. It removes the only person currently able to interpret it." A longer silence. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," she said. "I'm negotiating terms. I'll give you full access to everything, my complete research, my analysis, my models, the resonance channel protocol, everything, in exchange for one thing." "What?" the gray suit said. "A seat at the table." It took 6 weeks to get the seat. The negotiation was not comfortable, and she did not find it comfortable, and she did not pretend to. There were people at very high levels of the Emergency Council who wanted the alien contact managed by military intelligence. There were people who wanted her analysis, but not her presence. There were people who considered her an anomaly to be incorporated rather than an expert to be consulted. She continued conducting ongoing conversations with the Vreth through the resonance channel she rebuilt on a frequency the gray suits hadn't yet located. She went to work. She came home. She ate at odd hours and slept in her lab chair more than once and drank the terrible coffee and hummed her mother's melody and did the work. The Luna ring came back in the mail. A small white box on her doorstep one morning, no note inside, the ring sitting on cotton. She picked it up and turned it in the light. The pale stone caught it the way it always had, luminous and cold. She stood in her doorway for a long moment, feeling its weight. 6 months of sleeping with this thing against her sternum. 6 months of thinking it meant something about the future. She carried it inside. She put it in the back of her jewelry drawer. She went to work. The seat came through 2 weeks later. Not the seat she'd asked for, a better one. Special advisor on xenobiological communication, reporting directly to the council, with authority to conduct negotiations without pre-approval and full security clearance across every classification relevant to the contact event. The gray suit delivered the paperwork himself, which she suspected was not accidental. She signed where indicated. She went back to work. The Vreth network was not what the emergency council had imagined. She spent the first month of official access presenting this to every relevant body, using the information the Vreth had provided through the resonance channel and her own analysis of their civilization structure. She did not deliver this gently or with diplomatic softening. She delivered it as fact, the way she delivered everything, precisely, completely, and with citations. The network was not a military hierarchy. It had no territorial ambitions in the human sense of the term, no chain of command oriented toward expansion or control. It was, she wrote in the briefing document that became the foundational text of Earth's diplomatic approach to galactic civilization, closer in structure to a mycorrhizal system than to an empire, a web of relationships between civilizations stretching across vast distances, maintained not through power, but through the accumulated weight of mutual interdependence and shared history. Species helped each other because they had learned, over timescales that made human history look like a Tuesday afternoon, that the universe was large and difficult, and the only entities that had navigated it across the long arc were the ones that hadn't done it alone. The war document was shelved. Not officially retired, governments did not retire war documents, they simply stopped referencing them, but she watched it disappear from the active briefing rotation and did not comment on it. She had said what she needed to say. The rest was institutional time. She presented the network analysis to the emergency council in a 3-hour session. She watched them not understand it and then begin to and then struggle with it, and then, some of them, the ones she came to trust, start to see what it meant. That was enough. She wasn't trying to convince everyone. She was trying to build the conditions for understanding to develop, which was slower and more sustainable. Afterward, in the corridor outside the council chambers, one of the members, a woman named Adealu who had been a xenolinguist before entering government and who asked the best questions of anyone in the room, caught up with her and said, "How do you know they're telling the truth?" Serafina considered this for a moment. "I don't," she said, "but I've read every word of their molecular grammar, and I've spent enough time in the resonance channel to know that their communication system doesn't have a register for misdirection. Their language doesn't have the structural capacity for what we'd call lying. It has other things, but not that. That might just mean they're very good at it." "Yes," she said, "it might. That's what ongoing contact is for." The Vreth sent a second emissary 6 months after first contact, and this time, not through the resonance channel. A transport configuration arrived in the airspace above Johannesburg at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday in autumn, when the sky was the particular color it got in that season, a deep clear cobalt that she'd always thought was the most honest thing about the city. The transport made no threatening maneuver. It maintained altitude and did not respond to hailing frequencies, and simply waited, with the patience of something that had been doing this for 9,000 years, while the humans below made decisions. They called her, of course they called her. She drove to the landing site in a government vehicle, through the security cordon and past the news drones and the crowd that had gathered at every vantage point within 3 kilometers, everyone with their phones and their binoculars and their fear and their wonder. The morning was clear. The wind came from the east. She breathed it consciously, the way she'd learned to, attending to what moved in the air, what information was carried between things without announcement. She walked across the landing ground, and the transport opened for her. She had not told it to open. She had not touched anything. It had simply opened, the way things open for the person they have been waiting for, and she stood for a moment in the doorway of it with the autumn morning behind her and the dark interior ahead, and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a word for yet. He was inside. Not a projection, not a resonance echo. The physical reality of him, which was at once more overwhelming than the channel and somehow more settling, because the channel was always mediated, always carried the slight distortion of the translation layer, and this was just him, here, in the space she was also in. He was large. The third axis of his geometry was more apparent in person. His eyes were darker than the channel had suggested, and deeper, and he looked at her across the interior of the transport with an expression that had taken her months to learn to read, and that she now read the way she read things in her own mother tongue. Automatically, without effort, as if the meaning came to her directly rather than through translation. "You came," he said. "You called," she said, in a manner of speaking. "I wanted to come in person. I did not want to arrive without telling you first." She considered this. That's a change in approach. We are capable of learning. The face shift, that almost smile that she'd stopped being surprised by and started being glad to see. You are unexpectedly effective at teaching. She sat down. He had arranged the transport's interior with a human-scaled surface, with the specific angle of support that human bodies preferred, and this small, precise courtesy moved her the way it always did when she thought about what it had required. She looked at him for a moment. "Why in person?" she asked. "The channel works." "The channel works for information," he said. "I came for something else." "What?" He was quiet in the way she'd learned meant genuine consideration. Not calculation, but honest weighing. The effort to find the shape in human language for something that existed in Vreth experience without a direct parallel. "Among my people," he said, "there is a concept, there is no translation. It describes the relationship between a shaper and the one who has been shaped, but not as hierarchy, not as actor and recipient, more as," he paused, "as a river and the stone it cuts through. The river changes the stone. The stone changes the river's course. Neither is what it was before, and the change cannot be undone, and when the shaping is done in a spirit of genuine regard for what the other thing is, it becomes something beyond process. It becomes bond." Serafina looked at him for a long time. "Are you telling me," she said carefully, "that you came here in person to propose a formal diplomatic bond between yourself and me specifically?" "I am telling you," he said, "that in 13 months of conversation with you, I have changed the way I understand something I have been doing for longer than your civilization has existed. And I did not want that to be something that only happened inside a resonance channel." Outside the transport, Johannesburg was waking up. The news drones circled. The security detail waited. The world did its improbable business of continuing. Inside, it was very quiet. Serafina thought about the ring in her jewelry drawer, about the ballroom and the woman in Daniel's arm, about 400 pages and 3 automated errors and 1 gray suit, about 19 hours and 13 months and the terrible lab coffee and her mother's song, about the wind on the embassy steps, carrying something sharp and barely there that she had almost not noticed. "Almost. You know," she said, "most people when they want to establish a relationship start smaller. A message, a coffee." "We do not have coffee." "No, you have airborne biological restructuring agents." "We do," he agreed. "We are working on our approach." "I know," she said. And she did know. She had spent 13 months understanding the Vreth approach, its vast, slow, careful logic, the genuine if arrogant belief that what they were doing was for the best, and the equally genuine uncertainty about whether care and arrogance could coexist ethically. He had asked her that question himself once in the middle of a long conversation about the 3rd century Vreth ethics debates. She had said, "They can coexist. They cannot cancel each other out. You have to carry both of them." He had been quiet for a long time after that. Then he had said, "Yes." "You should have asked," she said again, now in the transport. "Yes," he said again, "and then I am asking now." She looked at him. The dark water eyes, patient as deep things are patient, and watching her with something she had stopped pretending she couldn't read. She thought about the night she walked out of the ballroom, the wind, the things she almost didn't notice. Asking what precisely, she said, "I'm a scientist. I need specifics." The not quite smile opened into something fuller. "To ride with me," he said. "It is a breath expression. To travel alongside the work, to be present for the ongoing project of the universe, to witness, and to be witnessed by someone you regard. It is the most intimate offer we make." She sat with that. "And you're offering it to me?" "I have been considering it for several months. I wanted to be certain before I asked." "What made you certain?" "You told me my methods needed work," he said, "and you were right, and I listened. And nothing in the last 9,000 years of my existence has made me as certain of anything as the fact that I want to continue being in the presence of the person who said that." Serafina Adiz Akafar, xenochemist, Federal Special Advisor, unofficial first contact translator for the species Homo sapiens, looked at the Lord of the Dark between stars in the autumn light coming through the transport's passive apertures, and felt something settle in her chest like a compass finding north. She said yes before she knew the full weight of what it meant. She said it the way she had answered the first transmission, quickly, without performance, because the answer was already there and delaying it would have been dishonest. There was still work to do, there always is. 6 more months of treaty framework negotiations, cultural exchange protocols, research partnership structures between the exobiology wing and the Vreth Biological Archives, presentations and press statements, and 2 very difficult council sessions and 1 conversation with her mother over video call, during which her mother was silent for 45 seconds and then said, "Serafina, are you happy?" She thought about it. "I think I'm becoming it," she said. Her mother nodded once precisely, the way she nodded when she decided to trust something she didn't fully understand. The night before the formal departure, she would not be leaving permanently. The work required her presence on Earth as much as anywhere, but there was a first voyage, a ceremonial acknowledgement of the bond. She went to her lab and sat at her workstation and looked at the place where she'd spent 14 days understanding what had come in the wind. She opened her jewelry drawer. She took out the Luna ring. She held it in the light. It was still beautiful. It had always been beautiful. But beauty wasn't the thing that had broken. Beauty was just the surface of a deeper problem, which was that she had spent 6 months pressing a ring to her heart and not noticing that she had been calibrating every sensor except the ones pointed inward, not noticing what she actually wanted, not asking the question she was afraid to hear herself answer. The shaping breath didn't do that to her. The wind unlocked other things in other people. What had unlocked in her was something else entirely, something that had started with a ring on someone else's hand and ended with her standing on an embassy step breathing in what was on the wind. She set the ring down on the workstation. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it to the emergency response coordinator's office downstairs, where there was a standing collection for the community aid program, and she donated it without ceremony. And she walked back up to her lab and hummed her mother's song, and felt the absence of its weight on her finger as something that was not loss but release. The transport arrived at dawn. She was waiting on the pad when it came down through a Johannesburg morning that was all rose gold and deep blue, the city lit from the side as the sun climbed, everything casting long, sharp shadows. Around her, the security detail and the official witnesses and the small group of researchers she'd invited stood in the specific silence of people watching something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. He came out to meet her. This was outside the Vreth protocol for arrivals. She knew this. She knew what it cost in terms of departed custom, what it communicated to his own people about the weight of the thing he was marking. She accepted it the way she accepted all of his careful offerings, directly, looking at it clearly, not diminishing it by pretending not to notice. He stood in the morning light and she stood in the morning light, and the wind came from the east, warm and carrying the smell of the city waking up, and she breathed it in deliberately. "Ready," he said. She thought about what she was leaving: the lab, the terrible coffee, the city, the ring she'd donated, the gray suit, the automated error messages, all the institutional patience she'd spent on things that hadn't deserved it. She thought about what she was carrying: 17 years of education, 7 years of xenochemistry, 14 months of secret analysis, 13 months of conversation with something ancient and strange and unexpectedly teachable. Her mother's song, which lived below conscious thought and would surface wherever she went, because that was what it was, a thing that couldn't be left behind. She looked at the researchers at the edge of the pad, found Dr. Amara Osai, who had been absorbing everything for 6 months and was as ready as anyone ever gets. "It's yours," Serafina said. "Don't let them put you in a gray suit." Amara nodded once, precisely. Serafina turned back. The morning wind moved through the hem of her coat. "Now," she said. She walked up the ramp into the transport, and the Johannesburg morning folded away behind her. And for a moment she heard the city one last time, the sound of it, the hum and breath of several million people continuing to be alive. And then the door closed, and it was just the hum of systems and the dark water eyes of someone who had been asking a question for 9,000 years and had finally been answered, and the long work of the universe stretching out in every direction. Boundless and strange, and exactly large enough for what needed to happen in it. She had ridden off. Not because she was led, not because she had nothing left, not because a ring had been taken from her or a life had dissolved or an airborne agent had restructured something in her that she hadn't chosen. She had ridden off because she had been paying attention on a night when paying attention changed everything, and because she had answered, and because the answer had been yes, and she had always, in the end, been very good at saying exactly what she meant. Months later, the following passage appeared in the first volume of the Earth-Vreth Cultural Archive, translated into 11 languages, attributed to its author by name. The compound did not give us anything we did not already possess. It could not. It was not designed to create but to reveal, to bring to the surface what had been living quietly and unacknowledged in the space below what we thought we were. What we are is more complicated than we knew. We are a species that breathes in what the wind carries and is changed by it, that adjusts and adapts and becomes, that survives not through rigidity, but through the capacity to shed what we have outgrown and discover what we were carrying all along underneath it. That is what they saw in us when they looked across the dark at this young, difficult, magnificent civilization that had not yet reached its nearest star. Not what we had built, what we were capable of. The two things are not always the same, and most civilizations, in our experience, are judged by the first before they have had the chance to demonstrate the second. We paid for the method in confusion and upheaval and grief, and in more than a few gray suits trying to turn biology into a war document. That accounting is real, and it will be ongoing. But we kept what the wind brought us. That is what humans do. We keep the things that cost us something. We hold them in the dark between our ribs where the heart is, and we carry them into whatever comes next, and we do not let go. We are, it turns out, exactly the species the universe needed us to be. It just took a wind in the night, and one woman who was paying attention to remind us. Dr. Serafina Adiz Akefer, Special Advisor, Earth-Vreth Cultural Exchange Commission. Filed from coordinates that do not appear on any terrestrial map. She did not realize, until she was already 3 weeks into the voyage, how profoundly different it felt to be somewhere that was not Earth. Not the physical experience of it. The transport's interior was climate-controlled to human-comfortable parameters. The gravity held. The air was managed with a precision she could have analyzed, but chose, for once, not to. The physical experience was careful and considered and almost unnervingly comfortable, because the Vreth had been at this long enough to understand that a species that spent the first voyage in biological distress was less likely to continue the relationship. They were practical in their kindness. She respected that. What was different was the quality of the quiet. Earth was never quiet, not really. Even the silence of her lab at 3:47 in the morning was a silence built on top of hum. The city's hum, the building's hum, the hum of instruments and infrastructure and several million people's collective being. She had lived inside that hum for so long that it had become part of the background of her own thinking, a texture so constant she'd stopped registering it the way you stop registering your own heartbeat. Out here, past the orbital limit, the quiet was of a different quality entirely. It was not empty. It was full of something that did not have a sound, the presence of space itself, which she had studied her entire career and had never until now been inside, and which was nothing like the studying of it. She found him in what served as an observation area, where the ship's hull became transparent in a way that she had stopped trying to technically analyze and was simply experiencing. The stars were not as she'd expected them, or rather, they were exactly as expected and completely unlike expectation simultaneously. She had seen photographs, spectra, models. She had not understood until this moment how utterly beside the point all of it was. She stood beside him and looked at the stars and said nothing for a long time. "The first time is always like this," he said. "Like what?" "The quality of silence from the outside. Your species has a word for it. The feeling of the sublime, something that exceeds your capacity to contain it, that insists on being larger than your frame. You know the word." "I have read your literature," he said, "extensively in preparation." She looked at him. "You read human literature in preparation for the possibility that you might say yes." He looked at her, those dark water eyes steady and patient. "I did not know if you would, but I read your literature and your philosophy and your music theory. I cannot hear your music the way you do, but I can understand its mathematics and your xenochemical papers, and your unpublished analysis that was submitted through 4 channels and suppressed." She stared at him. "You read the suppressed report." "We intercepted your transmissions," he said. "We had been intercepting human research communications since 3 weeks before the compound's release. It is how we identified you. Your 400-page analysis was the phase shift. It was the most accurate external analysis of the shaping breath we have encountered in 9,000 years of this work." She turned back to the stars. "You could have led with that," she said. "I was uncertain how you would receive the information that we had been reading your classified research." "Badly," she said. "I would have received it badly." "Yes," he said, "which is why I waited 13 months. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh coming out of her fully, unguarded, the way laughter came when something was genuinely funny and also genuinely true. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that. Somewhere in the past year, between the gray suits and the council sessions and the resonance channel and the ring in the back of her drawer, she had apparently stopped. It felt like something returning. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as something in the neighborhood of wonder, as close as Vreth physiology got to it. "That sound," he said. "Laughter," she said. "Humanity's defense mechanism against the absurdity of existence." "It is beautiful," he said. "It is involuntary," she said, which might be the same thing. She looked at the stars. He looked at the stars. The transport moved through the space between them with the quiet precision of something that had been doing this for a very long time, and the quiet was enormous, and the stars were vast, and she was a woman from Johannesburg with a song in her chest that she couldn't stop humming, and somehow this was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Tell me about this place," she said. "Not the technical data. Tell me about it the way you would tell someone who had never been outside before." He was quiet for a moment. The darkness between the stars is not absence, he said. It only looks empty from inside a gravity well, where the light of the star you live near washes out everything else. From out here, the dark is not dark, it is full. Full of the light of 100 billion stars that is too faint and too ancient for your instruments to catch all at once, but is present nonetheless, constant, traveling toward you from every direction simultaneously. The universe is not vast and empty. It is vast and saturated. Everything it has ever made is still here in some form, still moving. She stood in the observation area and let that settle through her. That's the most hopeful thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. I know, he said. I read your literature. The first formal meeting of the Vreth Civilization Council and the Earth Diplomatic Delegation took place 6 weeks into the voyage, at a location that Serafina's navigation instruments rendered as a set of coordinates, and her perception rendered as something she was going to need several years to develop adequate language for. She was the translator. She had known this was what she was here to do, had prepared for it, had spent 6 weeks in intensive study of the Vreth formal address conventions and the specific register used for civilization-level diplomatic contexts. She was prepared. She was not fully prepared. The council was 7 beings, each from a different species, each representing a civilization that had been part of the galactic network for long enough that Earth's history was, from their perspective, a recent and locally interesting development. They were as different from each other as any of them were from her. The translation layer she was working through was 5 levels deep, Vreth molecular grammar to xenochemical notation to standard xenolinguistic to English, and back again. And the margin for error at each level was non-zero, and they all knew it. She did the work. Not perfectly. No translator working 5 layers deep does anything perfectly, and she had spent enough time in the xenochemistry discipline to have made peace with the irreducible uncertainty of complex systems. But she did the work with the precision and stubbornness that she brought to everything, and she caught 3 errors that would have introduced significant misunderstanding into the diplomatic record, and she flagged them in real time and corrected them. And afterward, when it was done, she sat in the transport with her hands in her lap and breathed. He came and sat across from her. That was excellent work, he said. It was adequate work with 3 near misses, she said. The near misses were caught, that is the skill. She looked at her hands. The finger where the Luna ring had been was entirely unremarkable now, the small dent long faded. Just her hand, just her. One of the council members, she said. The one whose civilization I couldn't place. The one with the 2-axis geometry and the light emission communication. The Ian, he said. The Ian. They asked me something in the break through the translation layer. I want to make sure I understood it correctly. What did they ask? She looked up. They asked if I was the one who had changed the Lord of the Dark between stars. He was still for a moment. What did you tell them? He said. I said I wasn't certain what they meant. That was diplomatic. It was accurate, she said. I'm not certain what they meant. I'm asking you what they meant. He looked at her for a long moment. The dark water eyes, deep and patient and full of something that was very old and was also, somehow, looking at her as if she were genuinely new. The Ian have been part of the network for 6,000 years, he said. In that time, they have never heard me say that my methods needed work. She sat with that. You've been doing this for 9,000 years, she said. And in 9,000 years, nobody who received the breath had the tools to read the message underneath it, and the courage to answer, and the specific combination of precision and stubbornness to then tell me, without softening it, exactly what I had done wrong. That's not, I wasn't trying to. I know, he said, that is why it worked. She looked at the stars through the observation port. The light of 100 billion stars, ancient and constant, traveling toward her from every direction simultaneously. "I don't change people," she said finally. "You changed what I believe is possible," he said, in someone who had stopped expecting to encounter it. "That is not a small thing, Serafina." She heard her name in his voice and felt the resonance of it. The way the low frequency of his speech carried her name differently than any human voice ever had. Not better, not worse, just different, just specifically and irreversibly itself. "Your methods still need work," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know. You're going to keep asking me to tell you when they do. If you're willing." She looked at the stars. She thought about her mother's song in her chest, constant as starlight. She thought about the wind on the embassy steps, the barely there trace of something vast and non-terrestrial, the moment she had almost not noticed and then had. She had spent her whole career on things that most people would rather not look at directly. She had spent her whole life paying attention when other things were easier. She was very good at it. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." The transport moved through the ancient saturated dark, carrying the first human translator of the galactic network and the architect of 9,000 years of careful intervention. And the stars looked back at both of them from their vast distances, patient and permanent, and full of the light of everything the universe had ever made. Her mother's song rose in her chest, and she let it come. She let it travel through the observation area, barely audible, warm and old and specifically hers, the melody of a woman who had braided her daughter's hair, and sung without knowing that the daughter would one day carry that song to places the mother could not yet imagine. She hummed and the stars listened, and the work continued. That was enough. That was exactly enough. That was the whole of it.